Well, good morning to another fabulous day at the Falling Walls conference live from Berlin. Thank you for joining us again, or maybe newly. This is a very special format at this conference because it's an intimate talk, 20 to 25 minutes with outstanding scientists. We start now and it goes all day, so please stick with us. My name is Alina Schadwinkel. I am managing editor online for Spektrum der Wissenschaft. And being a science journalist, I'm prepared with a load of questions. But this is an interactive format, so in case you got a question you want to ask our guest, my guest, please raise your hand with the Zoom option, raise your hand, and my colleagues will notify me. And I will make sure to put in your question as soon as possible, and I will fit in as many as I can within the next 20 minutes. This being the first talk of the day, I'll just go to another few tech details again. Some of you may already know. If there are any problems, if you can't hear us, if something's not working quite the way you think it should be, please just let us know in the chat and my colleagues will take care of it. That said, let's come to the most important part of this format, my guest. Welcome, Sunil Amrith. He is a professor of history at Yale University, an author of 4 books, a 5th in the making, which is quite impressive. And as an historian of South and Southeast Asia, his research engages the spaces, movements, and processes of a uniquely Indian oceanic region. His work connects environmental history with the history of migration. And that's an approach he was awarded for, not only at Falling Walls, but with several other prizes. Again, impressive. I'm so glad you're here, Sunil. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you so much for having me, and thank you everybody out there for joining us.
As a juror of the Heineken Prize for History recently stated, Amrith, and now I quote, shows us how history and ecology are deeply connected to human life, and they are not separate concepts in a really beautiful way. The Falling Walls team just honored him as a breakthrough of the year. Basically his work, maybe not you as a person, but again, another prize. And Sunil, you argue for a new perspective on environmental history that focuses on the problems of environmental damage, accompanying human inequality, increasing unfreedom, and global migration. And I would love to hear more about that.
Thank you so much. That's a very generous introduction. The first thing to say is this is not my work alone. I think the field of environmental history has been a very vibrant and exciting space over the last 10 to 20 years all over the world. And I think the thing that's exciting about environmental history is it has to be interdisciplinary. We cannot understand environmental change without ecology and science, but also the whole spectrum of the humanities, history, anthropology, and the social sciences as well. And I think what I've been trying to do in my work is really to put together 2 fundamentally important processes that have shaped our world. One is the massive human transformation of the environment, of the natural world, and the other is enormous human mobility, and the fact that over the last 200 to 300 years, the population of the world has shifted in such significant ways in terms of where people live, how mobile people are, and the conditions under which that mobility has taken place, which is not always a happy story. This is not always a story of voluntary migration, but also a story of domination and coercion.
Sounds like a lot of data, a lot of things to read and to think about. How do you put all of this together? Could you explain us, how do you combine everything you just talk about?
So my discipline of history, I think, certainly has a different idea of what data is compared with, say, the more quantitative sciences. Historians, I think of data in a very eclectic way. So for me, data could be quantitative data, but it's also stories, narratives. Drawing from the methods of anthropology, a lot of my work has to do with field work, with talking to people, with collecting people's memories, their ideas, their stories. Historians, again, sort of in alliance with literary scholars, read texts, they analyze language. And in terms of putting it together, I mean, I think that is where history remains primarily a book discipline. I think it is often in writing, in that level of historians, either individually or as groups, as co-authors, trying to juxtapose these different scales, these different kinds of information, these different narratives, and these different voices. And it's a process that happens, I think, incrementally. This is not the kind of work where you necessarily start off with a big hypothesis. Again, this is where the humanities are perhaps a little bit different. It is very intuitive research that we do. I think a lot of the time it's about piecing things together bit by bit and being open to the unexpected, finding to the surprise.
You just said you talk to a lot of people, you want to hear their voices. That also means you have to ask the right questions, doesn't it? How do you come up with the right questions?
I think that's an enduring challenge, really. My approach when I do that kind of research is actually to be as open-ended as possible. You would be surprised, perhaps, those of you who do other kinds of work, how much you can learn by just asking somebody, where were you born?
Where were you born?
Where was I born? I was born in Nairobi, Kenya, and I've myself had a sort of interesting journey, albeit from a privileged position of moving through the world. But if you ask people where they were born, I realized that very quickly not only do you get a whole history of migration and family migration often, but also that very quickly leads to a discussion of how the landscape has changed or how particular occupations, working on plantations, for example, which is something I spent a lot of time working on, have had a fundamental impact on how human beings live with the rest of nature.
So you've worked with diverse archives, let's call it, maybe instead of data, oral histories, landscape, song, drama. So what's the main finding?
I would say that the main finding is that we need to think of migration and environmental transformation together. And when I say together, I mean in a complex and multifaceted way. We sometimes think, okay, climate change causes migration. The relationship goes in that direction. I don't think that's true. I think, in fact, what we need to think about is how, in this case, climate change, and in the past, other forms of environmental change, have been one factor amongst many, each amplifying or interacting with the others that lead people to move, and that movement itself has profound environmental consequences. And so it's thinking much more about not climate change causes migration, but thinking about migration as one possible response, and by no means the only or universal response, to an escalating series of risks. That's where the history comes in. I think those risks are deeply rooted in the legacies of history, of the past, and that the choices that people face, whether they can migrate when they face these new risks, is very often anchored in the particular histories of border making and migration control and inequality that so many people around the world contend with even today.
I think journalist and book author Tim Marshall, he wrote several books, for example, The Power of Geography, and he also writes something like, well, we wouldn't have as many problems if we wouldn't have that many borders, because otherwise the land would be open and free. And it's just when we talk about territory and who is supposed to be where, that's where the problems start. Is that something you would agree with?
I would agree with that wholeheartedly. And if I think about the part of the world I work on, South Asia, Southeast Asia, borders are themselves a form of risk. If you are a community facing increasingly intensive storm surges, if you're a coastal community, or prolonged drought, as so many are, whether or not you live close to an international border profoundly shapes the routes you can take, the options that are open to you. These borders are increasingly militarized places all over the world. And in a sense, that compounds the risk that people face as a result of accelerating climate change and as a result of much else.
What have you learned studying the region and the history of Southeast Asia that the rest of the world should be aware of, and maybe, well, to not repeat mistakes that have been made in the past?
I think studying that part of Asia teaches us a few things. One is that migration is, for want of a better term, normal. That the idea that migration is somehow anomalous or not the norm, which is to stay put in one place, is historically simply not true. And this is one of the most mobile regions of the world. And in a sense, that mobility far predates the borders that we now contend with. And I think taking that long perspective on a very mobile region, which is now amongst the most threatened by climate change, hopefully opens our imagination to other ways of thinking about who belongs where, and other ways of thinking about the fact that people moving is a very integral part of human history in that part of the world. In terms of mistakes to repeat, well, a lot of that is not specific to the region. A lot of that originated with the policies of the British Empire, which ruled over much of that region, and other empires as well, which have to do with categorizing people in certain ways, majorities and minorities. Many of those conflicts are still with us. We're still living with the legacies. If you think about the crisis of the Rohingya in Myanmar, for example, this is very much a conflict that has its origins in the late 19th, 20th century.
So looking at the world today and the way politicians and decision makers talk about how to deal with migration, how should they change their language maybe? Should they use different vocabulary, or is that too much detail and they should just throw overboard every thinking, every idea, and just start new and set up a new system of how to approach this task that's in front of us, or that has been with us all the time, as you said it?
The language is a good start. I think the language that all over the world, that political discourse uses to talk about migration as a threat, as a risk, as a danger, that has consequences. That has consequences for how migrants are treated, for how they can move through the world, for what their rights are. That is a very good starting point, to think in terms of a much more generous language when we talk about migration, to think of a much more empathetic and universal language when we talk about migration, a sense that in some ways we are all migrants. I do think we need fundamental institutional reform. That is unlikely to happen at one fell swoop, but I think that incrementally and bit by bit, new forms of, for example, temporary migration for people who are in crisis across borders would be an immediate and really essential step. The number of people displaced by the recent flooding in Pakistan, for example, 33 million people. Almost none of them are able to cross borders. These are people displaced within their own countries. If one could imagine a more generous regional framework where in these moments of sudden disaster, which we know are going to happen more and more often and will most directly affect the poorest people, then we can imagine that cross-border solutions based upon a principle of generosity would be a starting point which does not require us to tear up all the borders that we currently have.
That's a very interesting point you just made, that it's about staying within the border you actually grew up in. A lot of people do not want to leave their country or their region. They would love to stay, and they're not seeking to cross oceans. That's what you mean, right?
Absolutely. The most recent IPCC report and much other research across the social sciences and humanities tell us that, yes, a huge number of people in the world are going to be displaced by the effects of climate change just between now and 2050. But the overwhelming majority of them will be displaced within their own countries. And those who cross borders are unlikely to be making long journeys. They are going to be crossing borders within the regions that they live in.
Thank you. So we do have a question from the audience. Please speak up.
The early industrial activities have generated large deposits of toxic waste that now is embedded in sediments. How do you see this impacting present-day development of areas where these deposits can cause substantial issues when disturbed?
Thank you very much for that question. I think one of the things that we are learning is how prolonged some of the unintended consequences of our economic decisions have been. There was a wonderful talk at the Volkswagen Symposium that I attended yesterday, which was about thinking about long futures as well as long histories. And I think one of the things that strikes me is historians try, sometimes fail, but try to understand the decisions taken by any particular society on their own terms, trying not to project backwards too much from what we know happened next. And I'll use an example to try to answer your question. So one of the most dangerous phenomena that we see, certainly in the part of the world I work on, Asia, is old water infrastructure that is no longer fit for purpose. Think about all of the big dams that were constructed in India, China, and across Southeast Asia in the 1950s, 60s, 70s. Many of them are reaching the end of their lifespans, and none of them were designed for the levels of extreme weather that we are seeing increasingly frequently. So in a sense, we are left with that infrastructure. And we found, and we saw this in Pakistan, certainly back in 2010, when there were major floods then, that the most engineered landscapes are also the most at risk when things go wrong. But at the time, these seemed like a good idea. And I think that's what sort of your question about some of the lasting impacts of early industrialization bring to my mind. That very often these are liberating technologies. These are technologies that transform human life, or at least promise to transform human life. And very often in the enthusiasm for them, a lot of those costs, including profoundly human costs, immediate human costs. In the case of big dams, in terms of the numbers of people who were displaced from their homes by these projects, were bracketed to one side. The archival research I've done on the early dams in India, for example, you had people, scientists, engineers, genuinely believing that these dams would last for 200 years. And they were described almost like the pyramids. They were described as a gift to future generations. Things haven't turned out that way, but I think it's helpful for us to understand that that is, in a sense, the tragedy of our situation, that very often these technologies seemed to promise, in the case of dams, an end to hunger. This was a laudable and urgent goal. But these technologies, as many others, have had all kinds of unexpected effects.
I would like to follow up on that because, okay, at those times, people maybe had the best interest at heart and they advertised their projects well. Years or even decades later, one sees, okay, this doesn't fit in today's world anymore. But at the same time, other people still keep building dams like that. Look at Ethiopia, for example, and the discussion with Egypt's going on, or the discussion with Kenya, where the water shortage is a huge issue. Has humanity learned nothing from history?
Not just Ethiopia, Kenya. Large dams continue to be built in the Himalayas, and few things worry me more than the damming of the upper reaches of the Himalayan rivers in Tibet, the upper reaches of the rivers in India. The potential, as environmental activists have been saying for 30 years, the potential for catastrophe is enormous. Dams have a deep symbolic value in the global south. And I think one thing we need to bear in mind is we need to ask why. Why do they have that value? They have that value because of the sheer scale of inequality that they inherited when they became independent nations, a sense that the problems were so big that only the biggest technologies could solve them. And I think we need to remember how big the problems were. The hand that many post-colonial governments were dealt when they came to power. I think there are reasons why certain technologies then become sort of fixed with a symbolic meaning, that this is our freedom. Those kinds of ideas are very slow to change. Historical experience is not necessarily going to change them very fast. I mean, I think that's one of the things that the humanities has to offer this kind of conversation. It's all very well to have the scientific knowledge. We've had the scientific knowledge on climate change for quite a long time, though of course that continues to develop in very important and impressive ways. That hasn't necessarily, certainly in the country I live in, hasn't really at all led to fundamental policy change. And I think we can see the same when it comes to dams.
Thank you very much. We do have another question from the audience. Thank you for participating, guys. It's very kind of you. Please.
Yes, on the dams, one further question, if I may. What's your view on the dams being constructed, let's say, 10, 20, 30 years ago? So let's say Three Gorges in China, Itaipu in Brazil, Cabora Bassa and the like, basically. Are they also not sustainable and will impose major risks going forward?
I'm going to qualify my answer by saying I'm not a hydrologist, but based on historical experience, I worry profoundly about the safety of those projects from 20 or 30 years ago. There's plenty of evidence that environmental activists have brought to light that, for example, the parameters of river flow and rainfall upon which even relatively recent projects have been constructed really didn't take into account the accelerating impacts of climate change, and that's just for starters.
Thank you. We do have another question. If you would be so kind to maybe say your name and what you do so we can put the question a bit more into context. Obviously, if you don't want to, you don't have to, but feel free to do so.
Okay, I'm living in Vietnam now, so I have a question for you. Is what do you think about the phenomenon of people in Asia countries migrating to Western country? Will that have any major cultural and anthropological effects on the world in the future? Thank you. Yeah.
That's a wonderful question. I think that the migration of people from Asia to the West, and indeed from other regions of the world to the West, is already having a fundamental anthropological and cultural impact on the world. If I think about the United States, where I live and work, many of my students at Yale University, where I teach, are second or third generation immigrants. Many of their parents or perhaps grandparents moved to the United States from India, China, Hong Kong, Vietnam, Cambodia, all over Asia. These are now the 18 to 21-year-olds who are taking our classes, who are coming to my classes and my colleagues' classes. I think they're going to change the world. I really do. I think that the facility with which they move across cultures, the ability to bring together different traditions of thought, is something that I'm very excited about. Indeed, if I have a source of hope in what is often a very bleak picture of the world that we live in, it is that generation of people around the world, not just in the US, but everywhere, And it's not just those who are themselves from immigrant backgrounds, it's their friends who may not be from immigrant backgrounds, but who are nevertheless being shaped by these conversations, by that openness to the world, by that embrace of difference and different perspectives. So my optimistic answer to your question is, I think, yes, it already is, and it will continue to do so.
Thank you for that question. Thank you for that answer. I'm sorry to tell, but time's nearly up. So I've got one last question for you. In Egypt, the COP27 just started, and their UN parties will debate once more how to tackle climate change, as well as financing and developing climate change adaptation. If you would have a panel there, a talk there, what be your message to the world's leaders and decision makers?
Don't forget history. Don't forget that our choices are the result of choices we have made, we human beings have made in the past. And it is not that easy to break away from some of the ways in which we are stuck, from some of our inherited, not just infrastructures and policies, but ways of thinking. And I think cultural change happens at its own pace. We need to remember that. We need to take that into account, because that is in some sense the most fundamental change of all that we need to make.
Sunil, thank you so much for being here with us today.
Thank you for having me, and thank you everybody for those questions and for being here.